Today I'm going to do the third instalment in my series about floats, how to make them, how to design them, and eventually looking at specific float designs. Today is all about design, and if you look up historic fishing books, and I've got ones that go back to about 1860, you'll see that floats haven't really changed that much over the years. Historically, people just took bird quills. There's a crow quill. You just cut off the bottom bit, strip off the fibres. It's fairly waterproof. You don't even need to paint it. People may have used a sort of red paint if they had it to paint the tip. And then they made a float cap to hold the line in place with little sections of another quill just to hold it in place. This goes back hundreds of years. It is that simple. That makes a simple float. It doesn't take much weight, only a couple of BB at the most. And the fact that we call it BB, these are the old shooting designations, all the sizes that start at sort of SG, swan and goose, and all the rest of them, all the way down to dust shot, which we now call a number 8. The next refinement on this is to add a body. Balsa wood doesn't seem to have been around much before maybe the 1930s, without doing a massive amount of research. Certainly from the Second World War, some planes were made of balsa wood, and after the Second World War, people made model planes from balsa wood. And I know that I had balsa wood in the 1960s to make model planes, and I then used that to make floats. So before that, we had materials like cork. Cork's a tremendous material. It's easy to work. You can drill a hole through it, put it onto a crow quill, and that adds buoyancy to your float. And it's fairly waterproof. So these early floats, you didn't even need varnishes. Varnishes we take for granted nowadays, sort of acrylics and polyurethane, they didn't exist. There was varnishes like shellac, and that sort of works to a point. So very early Victorian floats would have used shellac, and like I say, sort of early oil paints. But very, very simple floats to make, very old designs. And of course, if you wanted a bigger quill, you could get, well, this is the ultimate. This is a huge, great swan quill, and suddenly it takes vastly more shot than the 2BB of that. It will take probably 4 or 5 treble A, and again, you can add a body to the swan quill, great big body on it. You can make a float taking a huge amount of weight. Interestingly, one of the early Avon floats that is known about was Captain Len Parker, Skipper Parker. His Avon float had a great big load of crow quill sticking out, and then a huge body at the bottom. So a float about 8 inches long with a big body. And it took so much weight, he used a sort of 1/2 ounce barrel lead to cock the thing, and they didn't cast it far. They just dropped it in off the back of a punt on the Avon. On the sort of fishing he looked after near Downton, they'd have these fishing punts, and people would go out, anchor it across the stream, and then trot with this float with, like I say, a great big weight made with and they'd long trot it a long way, hence a great big length of tip sticking out of the water. And of course, when a fish stops the bait in that strong current, it just straight under. No messing. There's nothing subtle about it. It just poof, straight under. So the Avon float, as we think of it, more with a body up like that, rather than a body down. So that design lives, that sort of idea of a quill with a body at the bottom lives on much more in still water fishing. So what we think of nowadays as a float for fishing running water, where we're attaching it top and bottom, is the buoyancy is at the top. I get some more examples here. We've got a Drennan wire stem Avon with a wire stem, balsa body, balsa tip, and an old 50-year-old ultra float, which was Billy Lane's float, just pure balsa, 4 treble A. Very light float, very simple float to make. Interestingly, when balsa floats started to turn up, probably in the 50s and 60s, and commercially certainly in the 60s, because Peter Drennan's first attempts at float making commercially were balsa floats, very simple balsa floats that he could make, not get, I don't know, I presume he bought balsa dowel and he could knock those out very quickly, just shape them a little bit and paint them, put an eye in the bottom. They were known as balsa quills. In other words, they were emulating floats like porcupine quills and bird quills like goose quills, but they're obviously dead straight, and you can alter the shape. As I showed you last time, it's a balsa float I made myself over 50 years ago. Very simple float, just a bit of balsa dowel, slightly shaped, rounded at the top and an eye at the bottom. Sometimes people put a little cane stem at the bottom because it's stronger than pushing onto pure balsa, but nice easy top and bottom floats. Balsa, back in the mid 70s, there was tremendous demand for floats, and as Waggler fishing started to take off, finding enough peacock quills became very difficult. These floats were being made by the 100,000. That's an awful lot of peacock quills. And I think they're imported from India, whether they're probably farmed out there. But Ivan Marks Float Company, Marks and Marlowe, they've got Ivan's name on them, I haven't actually got any, but they started to make Wagglers out of balsa dowel and then put in a fine tip in the top of thinner Sarcandus reed. Sarcandus reed was the other material, but with balsa they could make it quite thick and then, like I say, put a fine tip. And they also made a float like this. This is one I made myself. I'm trying to think what this is called, where it's called an arrow, and where it's thicker at the bottom and it tapers down. And later, I think it was Mark Pollard fishing on the Grand Union Canal, they started to make much smaller versions of this float for canal fishing, much finer tip, some of these floats were very short, few were as long as this. This one says, it's maybe a broken one, I think it's got 9BB on it. I think it was longer at one time and I snapped the tip off it. That's the trouble with balsa wood on these long thin floats, you can break it easily. But a sort of a Waggler fishing fairly rough water, my mate Phil used to like the Ivan Marks ones with a little cane insert at the bottom so you can put a float adapter on it. The basic idea of Waggler floats really took off in the very early 70s, just basically peacock quill, and people took floats they were using on still waters, including bodied ones like this, and started fishing them on the rivers, and that enabled them to fish much further out on the Trent instead of the sort of stick float close in. They could fish further out, and the bodied floats became known as swingers, bodied Wagglers. On rivers like the Nene, where the top of the water could go a different way, much longer floats, I've actually dug them out today, but much longer floats fish floats as long as 15 and 18 inches long, with more than one step on the antenna to get underneath that surface layer of sort of anything up to a foot, get that body down into that water that was moving the correct way, and the float would then go at the speed they wanted instead of being dragged along the wrong way, which could be upstream or downstream. It is easy to make floats with balsa bodies. I think you can still buy ready-made body bodies, like this one. And of course you can just put that on a piece of cane and make an avon float, very simple avon float. You can adjust where it is, cane stem, cane tip, buoyancy at the top. Of course you put it up the other way around, you've got an antenna float, you can have a nice long one. And this is just a kebab skewer of about, I think it's just under 3 millimeters thickness, and it's got a point on it, which is you'd get rid of that nice long float. One of the things about anything that is copied is that when you copy something, and people keep copying things, there's always a chance that the original, whatever you're copying, and what you end up with after many copies is not the same. I've got here, hope you can see this. This is Fisherman magazine from early 1974, and it was a special edition that was about floats, and someone's put some sort of wine glass there. And most of these floats, trying to get the light on it, are Drennan floats from about 1973. There's a few homemade ones, and some of those there you might be able to see there, they've got long stems, 2 millimeter stem with a sight bob on the top, and at the bottom you can't really see it, but there's a substantial body there. And this float had been developed by Peter Drennan and Peter Stone for fishing on gravel pits when it was quite rough, and it got called a wind beater. And the idea was the waves would go up and down on this long stem, but there was enough buoyancy in that thicker tip, that may have been pieces of balsa wood shaped, or a short piece of thick peacock quill, didn't really matter, as long as it was buoyant and thick. And that would hold up, you'd have an anchoring shot on the bottom, hold up against the toe and hold a bait steady on the bottom with a bulk shot down the line. It wasn't fish Waggler style with shot either side of the float, but just bulk shot down the line. And if that bottom shot came out, you might get a lift, or it would probably just go away. And these floats were long because they were for these bigger pits near Oxford. You get quite a big wave motion on them. They weren't designed for fishing next to lily pads at 1 rod length out. They were designed for fishing sort of 15-20 yards out, taking a good weight, sort of 2 or 3 swan shot. There were small versions. I'd bought some small ones, never really did that well with them. So that was the wind beater float. It was never fishing the so-called lift method. But here's an example of a float that's been copied and copied and copied, and people have forgotten what these floats look like. And what you end up with is a float more like this, but quite a short, with a long bit at the bottom, a bit weird, then some bands, and then on top of that there would be a little bit a bulbous end. So you've ended up with quite a short float with bands and a great big sight bob on the top, and it becomes called a tench lifter float, a tench float. And you think, what? The tip, the cane is quite thick. Like I say, this is about 3 millimeters instead of 2. So this is, the 2 millimeter is twice as sensitive as the 3 millimeter because of all the laws of physics. So it doesn't show lift bites as well as the original Drennan float, which has been carefully designed. They've made the antenna as thin as they could get away with. Obviously there's a point where it loses strength, so this is an important design consideration of any float. How strong is it? Will it survive? The message has got garbled. I don't think I've got any of the floats I actually use for tench fishing here, but my basic tench floats are insert wagglers made from peacock with, nowadays I just use the Resolve pole float tips, and they're thin enough. I have no trouble seeing them. I'm not fishing in rough gravel pits. If I did, I'd use floats with a much longer, thinner insert, again a peacock, maybe one with a body, and I've got floats to do that. I don't do much of that fishing, but be aware, if your design goes off copy and corrupts to something that it wasn't how it was designed, the proper form. There's an old game that must be old because it probably dates to the First World War, in which you get a line of people and they each have to whisper a message along, and you tell someone a message at the start and then you see what ends up at the end, but you're only allowed to say it once and whisper. And one of the versions is you tell someone at the start, send reinforcements, we're going to advance. And by the time it gets to the end, it's send 3 and 4pence, we're going to a dance. So it's sort of sounds the same, but it's not the same. And that's exactly what can happen with floats, where people don't understand what the design does. That's very true with stick floats. This is, I think I showed you last time, it's a Pete Warren original. It's got a bulbous tip, a fairly short balsa body, heavy cane stem, designed for fishing casters fairly close in, dotted down, thick tip so you can see it but not much left there. The balance is good, it will go through. In Pete Warren's hands it went through extremely well. He's very, very successful with these floats. There were later versions with, I don't know if it was fiberglass or something, stems made by MIDI, but this is an original one. It's very easy to think about stick floats, say, oh, we've just put a stem on a piece of balsa, that's a stick float. But the balance has to be right. You have to get that ratio of how much cane or heavier material to the balsa, how much balsa. It's easy to end up with what I would call a stemmed balsa. So you've got a balsa float with a stem on it. The balance is wrong. It doesn't cast right. It doesn't sit right. It doesn't fish right. Ivan Marks once said, if you get a stick float that's right and you throw it like a dart, and he could throw darts with not about the best of them, but he was no mean darts player, it will just flight beautifully. You could put this on a good stick float rod with a fine line, a sort of £1.5, £2 line with no shot on it at all, and cast it, and it will just cast. It will just go flight. If it sort of dips or wobbles all over the place, the balance is wrong. Ivan knew that. He knew that if you throw it and it doesn't wobble, if you cast it with no shot and no wobble, you know when it's right. But it's, like I say, it's very easy to chuck floats together and forget about that design. So you've got to get that design right, and that applies to all floats. Later in this series, the next part of the series, I'm going to talk about buoyancy and sensitivity in the tip. And then I'm going to look at specific floats in more detail, bring out some weird and wonderful examples. And so that's it for today. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.